Chapter 7. History in Hiding. Christianity, before it was called Christianity, began as a sect of Judaism. The original intention of its founder, Yeshua, Jesus, was not to start a new religion, but to reform the existing religion of the Jews. The religious leaders didn't take kindly to his interference, and in the end, Jesus ruffled enough feathers to get himself killed. But that was not the end of Christianity. It was much more influential among Gentiles, non-Jews, and evolved into a religion entirely separate from Judaism. The message of Christianity was communicated from place to place and across time as an oral tradition, the stories of Jesus being passed around by word of mouth. Later, these were written down as Gospels. From 50 to 150 AD, a number of documents were circulating among churches, consisting of Gospels, epistles, acts, apocalypses, homilies, and collections of teachings. Some of these were documents that made it into the Bible as we know it today. Others were not included. In early Christian history, these documents were not yet regarded as authoritative scripture on par with the Old Testament. The church was more concerned with practical and moral matters than with theology. Between 140 and 200 AD, Christianity began to organize its teachings. This was done as a defense against the rise of several alternative versions of Christianity, derisively referred to as heresies: Marcionism, Gnosticism, and Montanism. When it came time to decide on a definitive list of books, called a canon, that would become the New Testament, there was much debate over which books should be included and which discarded as fraudulent. Among the documents under consideration were the following, which may be unfamiliar to Bible readers as they were ultimately rejected: Hermas, Wisdom, the Acts of Paul, 3 Corinthians, Barnabas, Didache, the Revelation of Peter, the Shepherd, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Preaching of Peter, the Traditions of Matthias, the Sibylline Oracles, and the Oral Gospel. Several church bishops suggested canons, but none were in complete agreement. There was widespread accord about certain books, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and much disagreement over others, especially the epistles of John and Revelation. How did this entangled mess of information and misinformation get sorted out? A defining moment was the First Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, under the leadership of Emperor Constantine of Rome. Constantine had become a Christian in 312 AD, and he later declared Christianity to be the state religion of Rome. This imbued Christianity with a power it had never possessed before. Bishops assembled for the First Council of Nicaea and decided upon what would become known as the Nicene Creed, a definitive statement of what Christianity was to be from then on. The significance of the 4th century, as opposed to the 1st, in defining the shape of Christianity, is evidenced by the fact that to this day we refer to the Roman Catholic Church. The final decision on which books would be included in and excluded from the New Testament canon was made at the Synod of Hippo, 393 AD. The list included all the books found in our modern New Testament. The original Catholic Bible also included several intertestamental apocryphal works, whereas Protestant Bibles today omit these as non-inspired. Protestant scholars will argue that the Church's original choice of divinely inspired books was correct because God's providence oversaw the decisions. How then do they justify the removal of several of them over 1,000 years later? Today's Christian apologists tend to assert that highly rational criteria went into judging whether a document should be canonized, as though the bishops of antiquity reasoned in the scientific manner of the modern age. This is a gross exaggeration of the reality. Consider the distinctly unscientific thinking of the early church father St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century on the matter of why there ought to be 4 Gospels. Quote, "The Gospels could not possibly be either more or less in number than they are. Since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the church is spread over all the earth, and the pillar and foundation of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it fittingly has 4 pillars. everywhere breathing out incorruption and revivifying men. From this it is clear that the Word, the artificer of all things, being manifested to men, gave us the gospel, fourfold in form, but held together by one Spirit. As David said when asking for his coming, O sitter upon the cherubim, show yourself. For the cherubim have 4 faces, and their faces are images of the activity of the Son of God. For the first living creature, it says, was like a lion, signifying his active and princely and royal character. The second was like an ox, showing his sacrificial and priestly order. The third had the face of a man, indicating very clearly his coming in human guise. And the fourth was like a flying eagle, making plain the giving of the Spirit who broods over the church. Now the Gospels in which Christ is enthroned are like these. End quote. St. Irenaeus, Against Heresies. St. Irenaeus' insistence on 4 legitimate Gospels boils down to an entirely subjective game of join the dots, wherein he attempts to imbue the number 4 with mystical significance. When such blatantly irrational thinking was the norm in ancient times, it's difficult to have any confidence in the canon of the New Testament as divinely chosen. Researching the history of Christianity reveals a minefield of potentially wrong conclusions. Part of the problem with getting to the truth is that some scholars approach history with the intention of making Christianity look as good as possible. Richard Buis, author of The Resurrection, Fact or Fiction, 1989, asserts that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke must surely reflect accurate history because 3 distinct authors recount the same events with astounding accuracy. This argument looks good on the surface until you do a little more research. Most scholars tend to regard the Gospel of Mark as the earliest written of the 3 in question. It was then used as a source from which Matthew and Luke extracted material for their individual texts. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, written independently of each other, also feature common material not found in Mark, so scholars postulate that there was another source, Q, a hypothetical lost document containing sayings of Jesus. Matthew and Luke, but not Mark, drew information from Q. This scenario perfectly explains the commonalities in the 3 Gospels. The resurrection was not corroborated by multiple sources in the way that Buis suggests. Buis was also happy to quote the Jewish historian Josephus, born 37 or 38 AD, as evidence. Quote, Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. End quote. Flavius Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. Emphasis mine. Christians sometimes use this passage as evidence that Jesus was a real man who did the miraculous deeds recorded in the New Testament. But with a little additional research, we learn that this passage has been disputed since the 17th century, and from the 18th century the consensus view among historians has been that the references to Jesus were not in the original text, but were deliberately inserted in a later edition. It's not hard to see the logic. Would a Jew really say of Jesus, he was the Christ? Clearly not, since the Jewish people rejected him as their Messiah, except for those Jews who converted to Christianity. Josephus was not numbered among them. So how much or how little of the quoted passage was in the original edition? That's up for debate, but Christians will typically side with whatever allows them to best defend their position. In other words, they claim that only the bits I've italicized were additions. The truth is, we just don't know. The passage was clearly tampered with for the purpose of defending Christianity. How much or how little is unknown. Since no firm conclusion can be made, no evidence for the historicity of Jesus can be drawn from it. Knowledgeable Christians also like to use the example of the 1st century Roman historian Tacitus circa 55 to 120 AD, in defense of the historicity of Jesus. Tacitus recounts the Great Fire of Rome, for which some blamed Emperor Nero. Quote, "To get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out." End quote. Cornelius Tacitus, Annals. The above reference certainly lends credibility to the view that Jesus was a real person, but does more harm than good to the notion that his miraculous deeds were well attested. Note that Christianity is referred to as a mischievous superstition. Indeed, the only records we possess of the miracles of Jesus are the Gospels themselves. We might also mention the miracles in various apocryphal writings of the period, but Christian scholars themselves deny the veracity of these documents, so we needn't go there. On a side note, I can't help but smile when I hear a Christian apologist marveling at the remarkable consistency of the Bible as a whole. Since the early Christian bishops gave themselves permission to exclude from the canon any book that proved inconsistent, of course the Bible would be consistent. Even without the record of Tacitus, it's fair to say that there likely was a real Jesus, who was an influential teacher with a significant number of followers, and he was probably executed for his religious troublemaking. We can infer this on the grounds that Christianity did not spring from thin air. The most natural explanation for its existence is the reality of its founder, just as Buddhism originated with a man called Siddhartha Gautama, and Islam with Muhammad. The problem lies in separating the historical facts from the legends. Did Jesus' execution on the cross really fulfill Old Testament prophecies? Or was it a great surprise to his followers, who then sought to account for it by manufacturing myths about their leader? For instance, it is recorded that Jesus was from Nazareth, but according to Old Testament prophecy, Micah chapter 5, verse 2, the Messiah would come from Bethlehem. In order to overcome this discrepancy, a story is invented about Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem of Judea to take part in a census, one which is not confirmed by any extra-biblical source. While there, pregnant Mary gives birth to Jesus, conveniently fulfilling the messianic prophecy before returning home to Nazareth. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke include this story, known as the Nativity, while Mark and John omit it. Another prophetic aspect of the Nativity is the virgin birth, included as a fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. It is remarkable that 2 of the 4 Gospel writers choose to omit something so vital to the Christian religion. Christians may be convinced of the historicity of the virgin birth and the resurrection, for the Bible tells me so, but it is all too plausible that these details were retroactively fitted into the history of Jesus to make sense of his highly inconvenient death. Such suspicion is all the more justified when we learn that most scholars believe the original text of the Gospel of Mark ended at chapter 16, verse 8, with the discovery of the empty tomb of Jesus. Verses 9 to 20 contain an account of resurrection appearances. This section is missing from the earliest manuscripts, which suggests that it was a later addition to the text. Christian apologist Josh McDowell, in The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, objects to this kind of historical skepticism on the grounds that there is a wealth of other literature from antiquity that is accepted as factual with far less evidence available than what we possess for the New Testament. The skeptic is accused of allowing an unjust anti-supernatural bias to sway his opinion. But a prejudice against the supernatural is entirely understandable and rational. We base what we believe on our personal experience of life, where we find that the miraculous is notable by its absence. Through the repetitious nature of experience, we learn that gravity holds us down, and we trust that we will not unexpectedly rise up into the air. We learn that when a person dies, he stays dead. A 3-day-old decomposing corpse is not going to just get up and walk. When faced with an astonishing claim, it is entirely reasonable to ask, how sure can I be that this really happened? The history of the world is a complex tapestry, and we are sometimes reliant on making best guesses based on varying qualities of evidence. Sometimes there are whole gaps where we have to make huge assumptions about what likely took place to get us from A to B. And history is always open to reinterpretation through new archaeological findings. It does not have the rigidity of fields like mathematics and physics. There is nothing unfair or unjust about taking a skeptical stance to allegedly supernatural events in antiquity. Is the Bible the only historical record containing the supernatural? No. For instance, Siddhartha Gautama was probably a real person, born over half a millennium before Jesus. Just like the Jesus story, various miraculous deeds are recorded about the Buddha, but these are likely nothing more than exaggerated expressions of hero worship. Are the supernatural events from any ancient document taken seriously by scholars? No. When dealing with the ancient world, truth and legend are unavoidably woven together. When a Christian apologist makes a big noise about the undeniable historical facts of the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels, he has lost all perspective. Similar miracles are also found in the admittedly fraudulent apocryphal books. Consider this excerpt from one of the infancy Gospels regarding a very young Jesus with his mother in Egypt. Quote, "And it came to pass, when the most blessed Mary went into the temple with the little child, that all the idols prostrated themselves on the ground, so that all of them were lying on their faces, shattered and broken to pieces. And thus they plainly showed that they were nothing. Then was fulfilled that which was said by the prophet Isaiah, Behold, the Lord will come upon a swift cloud, and will enter Egypt, and all the handiwork of the Egyptians shall be moved at his presence." End quote. Pseudo-Matthew. This miracle is presented in a style identical to those in the canonical Gospels. It even features the fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy, a common trend in the New Testament. Although in this instance we must conclude that it is a deliberately falsified fulfillment, since the writings of Pseudo-Matthew are not recognized as legitimately historical. We are expected to believe that all of the miracles in the canonical Gospels are real, while all of the miracles in the non-canonical Gospels are fictitious. It is abundantly clear from the evidence at hand that miracle-making and prophecy-fulfilling were popular writing exercises among Jesus' followers. The most damning part of the story is that not a single supernatural act surrounding Jesus can be adequately verified by secular history. One of them in particular was as noticeable as a nuclear bomb. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, the following astronomical event allegedly occurred. Quote, "It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two." End quote. Luke chapter 23, verses 44 to 45. This was no eclipse. Those last only a few minutes, not 3 hours. You would think that something so out of this world would merit mention by numerous secular writers who directly experienced it. No such evidence exists, which is very telling. In fairness, the early historian Thallus mentions the darkness, attempting to explain it as an eclipse. But is he writing as an eyewitness of the event, or is he merely commenting on existing Christian writings? We can't be sure. This alone is certainly not sufficient to convince me that a supernatural event happened in the skies over 1st century Palestine. The overall climate of silence on the matter is far more convincing. Even when skeptical of miracles, we should have nothing to fear by being open to their possibility. All it would take to change our minds is evidence. Understandably, for a claim so contrary to experience, the evidence would have to be beyond reasonable doubt, like a historical record, free from the suspicion of embellishment and corroborated by multiple varied sources. The New Testament falls colossally short of that mark. The similarities between the account of Jesus' life and the myths of many pagan sun gods is certainly significant. To merely scratch the surface of this, note that the traditional birth date of Jesus is the 25th of December. It's common knowledge today that we have no information about an actual birth date. Christmas Day on the 25th of December was first celebrated in the 4th century, the time of Roman Emperor Constantine. But the date already had massive significance in pagan religions. The winter solstice, which takes place on the 21st or 22nd of December, is when the sun stops moving south and we experience the shortest day. On the 25th of December, the sun visibly begins moving northward, heralding the coming of spring and new life. It is the birth or rebirth of the sun. Pagan history has many accounts of sun gods who are said to be born on the 25th of December, because ancient people were aware of the cycle of the sun. For instance, in Babylon, the feast of the son of Isis, the goddess of nature, was celebrated on the 25th of December. Partying, gluttonous eating and drinking, and gift-giving were traditions of this feast. Ring a bell? In the early Christian era, the Roman god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, was born on the 25th of December. In 350 AD, Pope Julius I declared that Christ's birth would be celebrated on the 25th of December. This decision was clearly a deliberate concession to pagan beliefs, in an attempt to make Christianity easier to accept. In effect, you can keep your religious festival, only change the name of your God. The fact that we continue to celebrate the birth of Christ on the 25th of December to this day just goes to show the power of religion to perpetuate a lie through century after century with the greatest of ease. In considering whether the account of Jesus' life is based on earlier myth, it's not even necessary to venture outside the Bible. The Old Testament account of Joseph from the latter chapters of Genesis bears startling parallels to Jesus' life. To quote just a fraction of these, Joseph was one of 12 brothers. Jesus had 12 disciples. Joseph was brought to Egypt as a young boy, as was Jesus. Joseph was betrayed by his brother Judah. Jesus was betrayed by his disciple Judas. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. Jesus was sold for 30. Joseph was tempted to sin by Potiphar's wife. Jesus was tempted to sin by Satan in the wilderness. Joseph was imprisoned with 2 criminals. Jesus was hung on the cross between 2 criminals. Joseph became the savior of Egypt and the surrounding nations. Jesus became the savior of the world. Christians themselves acknowledge the parallels and have a name for the phenomenon, stating that Joseph was a type of Jesus. That is to say, God specifically ordered the events of both lives to reveal this synchronicity. I would ask, is it more appropriate to jump to the supernatural explanation or to consider the simpler one? Both accounts are a mix of history and legend, telling the same symbolic story with different details. Many astounding similarities are also reported between Christianity and other pre-Christian pagan religions, including accounts of miraculous births and resurrections. This was acknowledged by the early church father Justin Martyr, who said, "For when they say that Dionysus arose again and ascended to heaven, is it not evidence that the devil has imitated the prophecy?" Again, jumping to the supernatural explanation over the rather more straightforward view that aspects of the life of Jesus were retellings of older myths. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed by information at this point, here's a thought that might help simplify matters. We are all being told to bet our lives on a historical probability. We are not being instructed to bow before fact. How reliable is the historical accuracy of the life of Jesus? Based on the level of research I have done, I would say not nearly reliable enough. We can illustrate the same problem with the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. Like Jesus, he left behind no writings of his own. We know something of his life and philosophy only through the writings of others who spoke of him, principally Xenophon and Plato. The trouble is, they each said different things about him, one contradicting the other, and we may never be certain which account was the more honest. The historical Socrates is forever lost amid a mixture of truth and falsehood. What, then, makes the exploits of Jesus so factual, when we have no source besides the Gospels themselves for confirmation? Unable to convince a person using reason and evidence, the Church then seeks to coerce through the fear of hell, the dread of a place that no one could possibly know is real, unless the information had been communicated to man by God himself. Of course, if this God really has spoken to the human race in antiquity, then that changes everything, and people like me are doomed. But you would have to prove that, and so we come full circle back to a consideration of the historical evidence, which falls flat on its face. I am disappointed in myself that I didn't investigate this much earlier in life, preferring instead to wallow in the fog of partial information from church life, rarely studying outside my comfort zone. I am staggered by how simple some of this information is, but of course, it's only our personal agendas that make things complicated. When you make the decision to simply look for the truth, instead of always measuring new information against a treasured belief system that you feel you must defend at all costs, things look a lot more straightforward.